Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We are doing Let's Rant with Scrapperlock. We're using our Mutation Stalker again, Psyop, who is 14th level, and very close to 15th level. We're just a smidge. And what I really want is 16th level because I believe at 16th level that will open Indomitable Will, which is finally our Mes Defense, and it won't hurt me anymore that I keep forgetting to take a break free with me. I'm actually going to grab one right now. Oh, I can't get one from him. Oh, well. So this is our next contact. We're going to go ahead and start doing missions from him. I'll go do the security chief mission. And while we're going, it's time for a Let's Rant. And this is going to be an actual rant. Some of them where I'm just talking about like general advice and that sort of thing, how to play a game. But now I'm going to rant. And before we continue, I'm actually going to read this out. So somebody shared with me a tweet by Mr. James Haeck, who used to work at D&D Beyond. I don't know if he still does, but he's a professional game writer. He's won any awards, and he designed the Tal'Dorei campaign setting Reborn, according to his Twitter. And he put out this tweet that absolutely I disagree with, and this is what I'm going to rant about today. And his tweet says, every D&D campaign should have 3 storylines which are all interwoven and occurring simultaneously. Not every character's backstory should connect to all of them, but every character should connect to at least one of them. I like rituals, war, and monsters. How about you? And most of the people said this is great advice. Great advice. One person even said, this is what the story of Dragon Age Origins was like. All of the NPCs in your party had interwoven storylines that connected with the main storyline, and your character's storyline connected with it, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to vehemently disagree with Mr. Haeck. With all due respect, it is absolutely not true that every D&D campaign should have 3 interwoven storylines. That is blatantly false, and I would like to ask Mr. Haeck, for example, what about a West Marches campaign, buddy? West Marches campaigns explicitly don't have fixed storylines at all because they have rotating groups of players. And you can't connect storylines to backstories of the characters because you don't know who's going to show up each week. It's whoever wants to make it. There might be 15 or 20 players and only 4 or 5 people are going to show up. And you can't run a storyline that way. You cannot. Is he saying that there shouldn't be West Marches D&D campaigns? Who is he to determine that? Every D&D campaign would mean you have to do this in the West Marches. Because every means all. Every single one. No. You don't do this in the West Marches. The West Marches campaigns are explicitly not about interweaving storylines between backstories and characters, and they don't have long-term plots. And the reason is that you don't know who's going to be there on a given day. And so in a West Marches campaign, whoever shows up, you always start and end it at the main base, right? Whether it's a stronghold or a tavern in the city or whatever. You start in the town. And the rule, and what's his name? Trevor Duvall has a great explanation to this. Also, Dungeon Craft. Go to their channels. Professional Dungeon Master on Dungeon Craft or Trevor Duvall on Me, Myself, and Die. And they talk about West Marches. They both explain the same thing. You start with the group must start end in town every session. They have to get back to town at the end of the session. They can't stop in the middle of a dungeon. And the reason they can't stop is because next week there might be different people. And we can't have one of the guys out in the middle of a mine when the rest of the party is back in town going into the basement of an inn, right? And so you explicitly don't have storylines like that, right? If there's a story, it only happens for the session, period. Not fighting super trolls. So West Marches, bam. You cannot do this in that campaign. So no, every campaign shouldn't have 3 interwoven storylines with the stories of the backstories of the characters interweaving with some of those plots. That's number 1, right? Number 2 is, what if you have rotating GMs? Are you expecting the rotating GMs to interweave with their plots? No, that doesn't work either, right? Not every campaign is going to be a weekly critical role, same 5 people, all with rich backstories, voice actors. Not every campaign is like that, Mr. Haeck. Maybe yours are, right? He does these online actual plays, and I'm sure, and I think his wife did played in some of them, and okay, so that's how they do it. Their campaign is like that. Great, you can run it that way. That's fine, but it's not every campaign. It's just not. You That's terrible, terrible advice. You're telling players that they should fit all campaigns. Every D&D campaign should fit into this formula. That's absurd. So, just on its face, this is a nakedly false statement. There are at least 2 obvious types of campaigns, those being West Marches and rotating GM campaigns, that do not fit into his statement. But let's now take a look at what if you are running a weekly or a semi-weekly, whatever, bi-weekly campaign for the same 4 or 5 people, and they've written good character backstories, and you're playing more sort of traditional, what's now considered the traditional, let's say modern traditional, right? Because the real traditional way to play D&D was West Marches and that kind of stuff. That's the way my friends and I did it. Whoever showed up that day at one of our houses was playing D&D with us, right? And what we had was, instead of one group of adventurers that were all based in the same place, we just had different parties, right? And we just played. The reason we never got to high level was, well, we're just playing the party where we play when Paul's here today, right? And then next week, Paul's not here, we'll play the party we play without him, right? So we had 4 or 5 different parties, and we just used the party for the people who were there, right? And my best friend and I, we were always there. And then, so we had one party that was just the 2 of us. It was with his characters and my characters, and one of us played them all, and the other one GM'd it. And then we had this third guy who often played with us, so when the 3 of us were together, we played that party. And then we had these 2 other guys who sometimes played with us, so when all 5 of us were together, we played that party, right? That's kind of the traditional way to play D&D, is sort of a West Marches. You just play with whoever's there, right? Not having this long, complicated, plotted out storyline ahead of time, but just play the dungeon that's there. That's the original traditional way to play D&D. But modern players play it more narratively, right? They have a story with a plot and a big bad evil guy and story arcs and stuff like that, and they play every week, much the way you see on these actual play shows. A lot of modern players like to play that way. So let's take a given. Okay, he's only talking about those kinds of campaigns. Is it true that in those campaigns you need to do this? You need to have the 3 storylines and interweave them together, and at least one storyline from each backstory of the characters, with at least one of these storylines that are all interwoven together. I would argue still no. Still no. You should not feel like you have to do it. Now, if you want to do it, go ahead. But I would say go back and listen to my earlier story about planning versus play, my earlier rant. And I was talking about the emergent story resulting from the interactions of the various players, but not up to any single player to determine. And I've got to level up. That formula also won't work for generating 3 interwoven stories, because it's whatever comes up at the table. There might be 2 stories, there might be 4, there might be 1. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't plan it ahead of time. So what Mr. Haeck is saying is, don't let the story come up and plan the story. And I'm arguing you don't have to do it that way. And not only don't you have to, but I suggest not doing it that way. And in fact, if you look at the advice of all of the channels, all of them, literally all, I've never seen one that doesn't do this, where they're advising you on how to run D&D, whether it's Trevor Duvall, who's just role-playing games, not D&D, whether it's, what do I want to do here? Hang on, just let me look at this. Okay. Whether it's Trevor Duvall, whether it's Dungeon Craft, whether it's dungeon dudes, whether it's Seth Skorkowski, Luke Hart on the DM layer, Matt Colville, all of them say the same thing. Don't write a Lord of the Rings style mega plot with all of these story arcs ahead of time and then make your players run through it. That's a railroad. And it's a lot of work. It's too much work. Luke Hart would say it's not maintainable. And what you want to do instead is just come up with some story hooks and let the players decide what they want to do, and then react to what the players are doing and come up with new stories based on what they're doing, right? The Dungeon Craft channel talks about this. Trevor Duvall talks about this. Randomly roll on tables for inspiration. That's not creating 3 storylines that are all interwoven, right? What he is asking you to do as a DM, and not just saying you could do it, here's a cool way to do it, but that every single DM should be doing this for every campaign all across D&D and the entire world. Every campaign should have this, he says. Every single one is to do this Lord of the Rings style, Tolkien-esque interweaving of plots that is probably way above the ability of most GMs to do. And we're going to switch context now because we've hit 15th level, so I want to go to the newer contact. See if we get some new ones. There we go. Okay, we got Pavel also. So we want to go to actually the train station because these guys are in Skyway. Yeah, it's not true that every campaign should have this, and in fact, I would suggest that you don't. I advise you to listen to the other DMs, the people who run a lot, the people who've been running a lot longer than James Haeck, and who aren't thinking like a professional designer, right? What he's saying is, here's how we write D&D adventures, quote-unquote adventures, which are campaigns, in the big published books. Okay, they can do that. They have a team of writers. They're professionals. It's their full-time job to do this, so they have the time to do this. Most DMs have a few hours a week to prep stuff. They don't have time to do this. They may not have the experience or the ability to do it. They may not have a group of players who want them to do it. Like, I explicitly don't want a bunch of crap interwoven into the story about my character's backstory. I'm not interested in that. I want to play the forward story. So when my best friend is like, I want to weave all this backstory stuff, I'm like, you don't have to do it for me. Because I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in finding out what's going to happen in the future, not what happened in my character's past. Now, that's me and my preference, but that's where I'm saying, like, every DM should weave these storylines in together. Not every player wants that. Not every DM wants that. Not every group wants that. One of the people responding, so many people said, oh, yeah, this is great. Well, I certainly don't agree with that. So one of the people responding said, again, yeah, this is how they did it in Dragon Age. Dragon Age is not a tabletop role-playing game. It is a computer role-playing game, and it is a literal railroad. It is a railroad. You can make minor cosmetic choices about the story, but the Dragon Age story will always go the same way. When my character first, I started out with a character who was like super honorable and heroic. I like playing heroic characters. Big surprise. My first character in Dragon Age, when I heard what the Grey Wardens were and what they were doing, when I saw what they did, right, where they took a guy who he was trying to join the Grey Wardens, and so were you, right? And these guys like protect people against the Darkspawn, right? The evil villain creatures. And so that's cool, and you want to be a Grey Warden, and then you find out that you have to like drink Darkspawn blood, right? One of the first quests, spoiler alert, is you have to get the Darkspawn's blood and bring it back to the guy who's the head, what's his name, Duncan, I think, who's the head of the Grey Wardens in your area. And then you have to do the ritual to become a Grey Warden. And the ritual is you drink the Darkspawn blood. And it'll either kill you, or it will make you able to sense darkspawn and give you the ability to oppose them, but it will ultimately, I think, kill you in some way. Either it ultimately drives you insane, or kills you in some other way. I can't remember exactly how. Let's see, is he going to give me missions? Yeah, let's do his missions. So there are 3 characters on tap to become Grey Wardens. You and 2 guys. So when the one guy hears about this, he's like, no, I don't want to do this. I have a wife. I have kids. I'm not doing this. And Duncan basically takes out a sword and kills him. There's no going back. You have come here. You cannot turn away. So drink it. And the guy's like, no. So Duncan kills him. And as soon as I saw that, I said, well, okay, that's it. My character's going to fight the Grey Wardens. Right? I'm going to find a way to fight them. Well, you can't. You have to drink the cup. You have to become a Grey Warden. You have no choice. And you cannot oppose them at any point in the game. So even though, as a player, I wanted my character to be like, no, I'll fight the Darkspawn my own way. Not this way. This is not the way I want to fight them. You can't do that. Because it's a railroad. So you have people saying, hey, great, James, this is how they do it in Dragon Age Origins. Well, Dragon Age Origins is a computer game. It's not a tabletop role-playing game. You have 0 agency in that game. You can only make minor choices. Yeah, you can choose to ally with this one or that one. You can have different NPCs on your group. But ultimately, what's going to happen in every run-through is you're going to become a Grey Warden. You're going to fight the Darkspawn. And by the end of the game, again, spoilers, you're going to fight the dragon. And by the way, the only way to fight the dragon is to use, pretty much, is to use the giant ballistas they have on the castle. I was so frustrated with this at the end that I actually wrote an open letter of complaint to BioWare and posted it on my blog back when I had a blog years ago. That I had this rogue. That was my main character, was a dual-wielding, backstabbing rogue. Right? And she was really good at it. But she couldn't fight the dragon because they had programmed the dragon to basically trash anything that's a tank. And you couldn't backstab it, right? All the abilities and stuff that I had built for my character to do were useless against the dragon. And what I ended up having to do was hide behind, in the ballista and shoot the dragon with the ballista. That's not what I wanted for my character. But the game was railroady, right? It was scripted. The dragon was going to do certain things on a script, and you were just going to have to react to it, and it was a video game. Now, as a video game, that may be acceptable. As a tabletop role-playing game, it's not. Right? So, this is a railroad, what he's describing. The stories are interwoven together. The only way to do that, to get it all to be that perfect, where you have 3 interwoven stories, and the stories must come out a certain way, right? And including connecting all of the backstories of all of the other characters to those stories. The only way you can do that is railroading. Matt Colville has a great video where he talks about the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as if they were role-playing games, like as you're playing D&D. And he kind of describes the Lord of the Rings as a railroad, right? That the characters kind of had no choice. The GM kept coming in and forcing them to do things because they had to go to Mordor, right? Frodo and Sam could never turn away, and anytime they tried to turn away, the GM brought in a new reason why they couldn't stop. Right, so they get to Rivendell, and Frodo's player's sick and tired of this quest at this point. I'm tired of the ring. I don't want to deal with it. It turns out, no, you're the one who has to bring it all the way to Mordor, right? And so then they decide to go to Mordor, and they agree. Okay, we're going to go over. We're going to go over the pass of the one mountain. We don't want to go through Moria, and the GM's like, nope, you got to go through Moria, right? And that's okay in a novel. Because it's a novel, and the characters don't have any agency beyond what the writer puts into the novel, okay? But in a tabletop game, Colville's point was this would be objectionable. Frodo's player would get frustrated because he doesn't necessarily want to keep doing this crap with the ring. He might want to do some other adventures, and you're not letting him do it. So yeah, there are 3 interwoven storylines in Lord of the Rings. The Frodo storyline, the Merry and Pippin storyline, and the Aragorn storyline. But that's a novel. It's not a D&D campaign. So, folks, don't listen to Mr. Haeck. With all due respect, he's talking from the viewpoint of a professional designer who plays actual plays on streams And he has implicit assumptions about his campaigning and his DMing style and his players' playing style that may not be and probably aren't true at your table. No one should be making a claim about how every D&D campaign should be. What every D&D campaign should be is fun for you and your players. And I was so glad one person did respond to that, and he said, no, I like no, no, and no to all of this. I can't disagree enough. What every D&D campaign should be is fun for you and your friends. That's it. That's what every D&D campaign should be. Just fun. If you guys are having fun, who cares how many storylines there are? Another thing I would point out is I'm not even sure if he really meant what he said, because then at the end, right, he says his storylines are rituals, war, and monsters. Rituals, war, and monsters are not storylines. They're themes. Now, if he wants to say every D&D campaign should have several themes, I would say 3 might be okay. I would argue it's ridiculous to have a specific number. Some campaigns might have 1 theme. Some might have 2, right? And you want, every campaign should have a few themes. Well, most adventure creation and campaign creation books will tell you that. Tome of Adventure Design, things like that. They'll say, come up with themes. I can't remember the Adventure Designer, which was written by somebody who wrote some of the Mythic Variations books, does it this way, right? And I think Mythic Variations 1 or 2, Mythic GM Emulator, they talk about this. I think it's the first one. They've got several themes, right? And the themes are mystery, horror, action adventure, personal, epic, right? And what they say is if you're going to randomly generate a story, pick a main theme, whatever you think is the primary theme, let's say horror, and then pick a secondary theme, let's say mystery, and maybe a tertiary theme, which would be maybe personal. And then you populate a random table with chances of whether different elements of the scenes in the story are going to be the main theme, the secondary theme, or the tertiary theme. So if he had just said, look, every role-playing game should have one or more themes, and you should try to make it so that the themes interrelate, I'd be like, I have no problem with that. Right? You shouldn't just do horror, 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 right? You want to alternate, and maybe some things from the horror theme relate to some of the mystery theme. I don't mind saying that, but that's not what he said. He said storylines. So if we talk about themes, I'm okay with saying, yeah, every D&D campaign should probably have some themes. Even a Wes March's game has a theme, right, which is adventure. Right? It might be mystery one day, right? I mean, if it's Wes March's, one of the weeks, the GM could say, we're going to run a murder mystery, and that's the theme of the week. I wouldn't say they have to be interwoven. In a Wes March's game, they probably wouldn't be. But this isn't what Mr. Haeck said, right? He wasn't talking about themes in his post. He said you should have 3 interwoven storylines, right? And that is ridiculous, right? Even professional authors don't always do 3 interwoven storylines. And most TV shows have maybe 2, right, for an episode. Because 3 is too many, and they can't get it done in an hour. So they have it's actually much more common in storytelling to have 2 storylines that interweave. The A plot and the B plot. There's often not a C plot. Sometimes there is, but often there is not. And you don't have to have a B plot either. Sometimes you just have a story that's just got an A plot, and you just follow it along. And I'm sure you can think of movies that you've watched where it's just one story, right? Like it might just be a chase through the whole movie or something like that. And there's fusion in it, but we'll kill everybody else beforehand so she doesn't screw up our assassinating. It always frustrates me when people are talking about a creative endeavor like adventure creation, and they're giving you these hard and fast rules. It used to drive me nuts in writing too. Like all essays should have 5 paragraphs. That's crap. You might have 10 paragraphs. You might have 9. You might have 17. It depends on the essay. right? And this same idea, all adventures must have all campaigns must have 3 storylines. What if I want 2? What if I want 4? And who says they all have to interweave? They could be sequential instead of because he's saying they're going on simultaneously. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's sequential. If you look at Kevin Crawford's stuff, there's nothing about 3. Kevin Crawford in Worlds Without Number says you can generate up to, he recommends no more than this, but up to 6 factions. And that every month of gameplay, every game month, you should, as a GM, go through and make some random rolls and see what happens to the 6 factions. Now, they might be interacting with each other, they might not, but this is potentially up to 6 storylines that are going on in the campaign outside of whatever the main storyline that the players are doing, unless that main storyline is them involving themselves in the factions. And why does he suggest doing this? So that there are lots of plot hooks. The players will hear rumors that the Thieves Guild was suddenly taken over by the Assassin's Guild because the GM rolled up behind the scenes in this mini game that Kevin Crawford created, which is absolutely genius. I'm going to probably use it the next time I run a game. The players, all this stuff is going on in the background as the players are like going on quests. And at some point, the assumption is that these things that are happening in the background will bubble to the surface. Now, he does say, try to stay below 6. 6 is max. Don't go over that. He recommends 3 or 4, right? So 3 is maybe a great number, but he doesn't give you a literal number. You have to have 3. He suggests that you probably want at least 3 or 4 to make it interesting, and that if you go over 6, his experience is going over 6 is very hard to manage, and he doesn't recommend that. Right? But he doesn't give you a single number, and he doesn't tell you he doesn't tell you that all of them have to interweave, and he certainly doesn't tell you that any of them have to connect to the backstories of the player characters. This constant obsession that people have with mining backstories for plot points. I mean, not every game group wants to do that. Not every player wants to do that. Right? In my Rome game, one of the players explicitly asked not to have her backstory explored. She just had her parents disappear because she didn't want to kill them off because she thought that was too cliche. And she had this young gnome who lived in the forest, and she had to have a reason why would she leave home. So she decided, well, she left home because her parents are missing and she doesn't have any reason to stay home. But her character wasn't looking for her parents. She just left home because there was nothing there for her, right? Kind of when Luke leaves, Tatooine, although his aunt and uncle were dead, there's nothing here for me now, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave, right? Now, personally, I would have done something different. I would have probably had her parents be dead just so that there's a reason for her not to go looking for them, because it never made good in character sense to me, to be honest, that her character... Oh, this guy's going to probably try to mez me. It never made good in character sense to me that her character would know that her parents were missing, possibly died in this tragic event that happened in the one town that got destroyed, and never go looking for them. But she had her reasons, and the relevant point is she did not want her backstory mined. Right? She just wanted to adventure with the rest of the party. That's it. And so that is not a player who wants their backstory woven into the 3 plot lines that you've got going. And so that's why you don't have to follow that advice. If you want to, apparently lots of GMs do. Lots of people are saying, yeah, cool, I do it this way too. Go for it. But you shouldn't feel like you have to do this. And I'm really aggravated that somebody who's so influential in the D&D community would actually give this advice and say everyone should be doing this. Every GM should be running your campaigns this way. No. And as I said, the overwhelming lion's share of advice that all the DMs out there besides Mr. Haeck give is not to do it that way because it's too hard and it's exhausting. Basic Expert, Dungeon Craft, Seth Skorkowski, Trevor Duvall, Luke Hart, taking 20, XP to level 3. Like, they all say the same thing. You don't need to put all this pressure on yourself to make these interwoven, complicated storylines that all connect to each other and alternate plots together, and they connect to the player character storylines. You don't need to do that. Your players can have a lot of fun at the table without that, and many groups do. Many groups do, guys. And then the other thing I'm going to say is he's making an assumption about the nature of the campaigns as well. We talk about like these interwoven epic plots and stuff. Okay, there are two types of you can lump fantasy into basically two types, right? And I never really understood the difference when people would talk about them because it doesn't sound different on the surface, right? One is called high fantasy. Okay, we're going to get this guy later. As a stalker, I like to kill everything first and then come back and get them because, then I can hide. There are two types of fantasy, just in general, broad categories. One type is called high fantasy, and the other type is called swords and sorcery. And I'll tell you, for the longest time, I never understood the difference because most fantasy stories that were identified as high fantasy have characters in them who use swords and spells, right? They have fighters and sorcerers. So what the heck is the difference between swords and sorcery and high fantasy? And people always, their example of high fantasy was Lord of the Rings, and their example of swords and sorcery was Conan. And I'd never read the Conan stories, so okay, whatever. I thought it was about the fact that he's a fighter, and he's not a sorcerer, and I wasn't sure where swords and sorceries came in, but I thought it meant high magic and low magic or something like that. No. If you read the Conan stories, right, all Conan stories are basically, they're all short stories. There's no novels, although a couple of the short stories are quite long. But they can be read, like I read them in the chronological order they were published because I like doing that. But they can be read in any order. And there's explicitly there's no like explicit chronological connection between them, or among them, I guess I should say. You can read them in any order. They can happen in any sequence, and there doesn't seem to be any relation within most of the text to other stories. He rarely references other adventures that Conan had. He'll reference things that he didn't write stories about when Conan was king of X and there was never a story about that. But he rarely references them, so that's why you can read them in any order. And so the Conan stories are always about this adventure, this moment that you're in right now, this quest right here, right now. And that's it. And there's nothing larger about the quest. It doesn't relate to anything else. It's just this quest right here, right now, in this moment. Right? Whereas in The Lord of the Rings, right, when they're going to Bree, right, they're going to Bree because there's somebody chasing them, because there's a ring, and the ring is related to this big bad evil guy who's going to take over the world. Right? So each element in The Lord of the Rings is related to this overarching plot that has epic and world-spanning implications. And so the way I had it explained to me finally was, and it made sense after reading the Conan books, is that a sword and sorcery type of story is an immediate, in-the-moment story that's only about this, right? You're going to this dungeon to defeat the necromancer and stop him from sending undead to the town. And this has nothing to do with the adventure you did last week, and it's going to have nothing to do with the adventure you're going to do next week. That's swords and sorcery. And now the adventure doesn't necessarily have to be one day, right? It could be a long adventure, but it doesn't necessarily relate to any of the other adventures in any particular way, at least not in the planning stages of the GM or anything like that, right? It might be that, by random rolls, there turns out to be a relationship between this dungeon and the next dungeon, but maybe like you find a treasure map in the bottom of this dungeon that leads you to an island off the coast of the nearest town, that'll get you into another dungeon, but that's it, right? There's no overarching plot. There's no BBEG of the whole series, and you're fighting the same minions over and over again. There's none of that in Swords and Sorcery. Each adventure is its own thing. Now, if you think back to old school D&D, what did they call the adventures? They called them modules, right? They were modular in the sense that you could play them in any sequence, and we did, right? We had multiple different parties go through the Caves of Chaos. We just assumed this is an alternate world with a different Cave of Chaos, right, or whatever, or maybe it's the same world with a similar Caves of Chaos just in a different place, or what have you. But yeah, we did that a lot, and because, or we did different caves with different parties, and what happened in one cave didn't really relate to what happened in the other caves. We didn't care. It was a different party, right? And so these modules are sort of designed to be playable in any order, in any sequence, and there isn't necessarily an explicit connection among them. That's Swords and Sorcery, right? That's an entire 50% of the genre that doesn't have interwoven, interrelated storylines and explicitly rejects that model, and instead is about individual adventures, this story, this plot, this adventure, and nothing else, right? That's actually the model that Gary Gygax was going for when he created D&D. So the original D&D module is Swords and Sorcery. The original D&D model doesn't have multiple storylines because you don't do that in Swords and Sorcery. There's one story. It's this short story. Conan is going to the Necromancer's Tower to rescue his girlfriend. That's it. There's nothing else to that story. Now, there might be some subplots and an A and a B plot and so on within that little story, but it's one storyline. And it has nothing to do with the storyline in the next short story where he's a pirate and he's trying to get treasure. And that has nothing to do with the next storyline where he's a king. Okay? And so not only don't you have to weave the stories together for D&D, but traditionally, classically, old school D&D never had that. It was originally meant to be Swords and Sorcery. Now, players liked Lord of the Rings, and having read Lord of the Rings, a lot of them wanted to have that kind of a story, and so they started making epic, high fantasy stories with interwoven plots and like where everything is about whatever this one thing is, the big bad evil guy, the one ring, the artifact of evil, whatever it happens to be. But, and we're going to go down and get the Arachnos guy now. But that was a choice made by the players and the GM who had decided that we wanted to do something epic with this game rather than the Swords and Sorcery stuff. That's a choice. If you want to do it, great. If that's what's fun, do it. Do whatever's fun for you. But it's a choice, and it's not something that every group wants. Some people like Swords and Sorcery better. Guys, I would have said, up until a year or two ago, when I read all the Conan stories and I started playing Ironsworn and all this stuff, and in getting and realizing the advantages of the Emergent story, I would have said, I prefer high fantasy. God, I keep missing. 95% chance, and I missed. I would have said that I preferred high fantasy. Right? Oh, this guy's moving, so now I'm gonna aggro that guy. Oh, that's so annoying. This is gonna be a tough fight. But we'll do it. Hopefully he won't. Oh, good, I made him afraid. So I would have said high fantasy is my jam. right? I loved Lord of the Rings. I loved the initial Wheel of Time books, which are also high fantasy. Everything's all woven together, way more than 3 plots in that one. There's got to be like 8, which eventually made me give up because it became like a kudzu plot. If you don't know what that is, go ahead and look it up. Um, but as much as I enjoy reading those, I think as a player, I actually enjoy playing Swords and Sorcery. Right? I actually enjoy playing the more modular, more fragmented, if we call it, stories, because it gives a lot more freedom to us, as players, to generate the story with the GM. And as a GM, I like it because the players can generate the story with me. So as I think I said in an earlier episode, my Rome game was an epic game, right? It was like he's describing. I'm not saying you can't do that. But after I ran it for a while, I was like, I shouldn't have done this. Because in the moments where we sidetracked to do side quests, and the players sort of sidetracked me into places I had not planned, those are the most fun. I mean, they did this whole diversion where they decided to try and find these ladies who were worshiping at this statue that they didn't know who the statue was because it wasn't a goddess that they recognized. It was actually the paladin of Venus. And they didn't know that, and even the people worshiping her didn't know that. They thought she was a goddess. And so they knew that there were these women in white robes who had tended to the statue. They were modeled on the Vestal Virgins from ancient Rome, and they wanted to get information out of these ladies. So they staked out the statue and they followed them and they went into the Bard's College, and then they decided we're going to go into the Bard's College. And I'm like, well, I don't have a map for the Bard's College. Fortunately, the session ended, and in the next 2 weeks, I was frantically generating up the Bard's College, and I came up with some really cool stuff. And I almost certainly would not have generated any of that if these guys hadn't decided that they wanted to go into this place I didn't expect them to go. And we had an awesome, I don't know if it took 2 sessions. We certainly did 1 session that was just absolutely awesome. And they snuck in, and they were able to find some secrets. I ended up writing this. I said they've got to find some information in here. So I ended up in the Bard's library. They found this. I think it was the head Bard's office or something. They found this canticle of the Titans, which told them all about the Titans, which they were trying to learn about. And they were all they couldn't find a lot of information. So I put this really cool canticle, and they found it, and they were all excited when they found it. And I just made that thing up in an hour, a few days before the session. I just looked up, how do you make a ballad, and I just basically did that, right? And I just followed the format, and it wasn't great, but they thought it was really cool. They got really into it. They loved it, right? And they had a lot of fun in that session because they were able to go in and oh boy, we don't have any break freeze here. Got to rely on these guys because I can't. Well, let me try and assassinate him. Yeah, this will be all right. They decided how to approach the thing. They first they went in and they tried to disguise themselves and talk to the Bard, and then the sorcerer stupidly tried to charm him and failed. We're now level 16, guys. The sorcerer tried to charm him and failed, and so he kicked him out, right? And he got mad at them, and I was like, "You're lucky he doesn't have you arrested because it's illegal to just cast charm spells like that." And so, they went to back to their inn, and they planned it out, and they decided what we're going to do is we're going to sneak in at night and try to find this information. So that's when I had to like, figure out like the map and everything. It was really cool. I think it took us 2 sessions to do the whole thing. I had no idea they were going to do it. None, guys. No idea. But they did that with their agency, and we are now we are safe. Now we are safe. Oh, wow, 26 hull protection. That's a lot. I had no idea what they were going to do. They came up with this story. They generated what they wanted to do, and it was really, really cool. So this is why I'm saying you don't need to have predetermined multiple storylines and interweave them. You can make great stories at the table. And I will probably never again do this where I'm generating stories ahead of time. I'll run the faction simulator from Worlds Without Number. Oh yes, I'll do that because that's emerging storyline, right? Each month I'll make a random roll and then I'll give rumors and stuff and let the players decide which rumors they want to track down or whether they even care that this Baron has just taken over somebody's manor or not, right? And I'll set points of interest out in the world, and they can discover them. I mean, the whole game Forbidden Lands, guys, is a map, right? It's a blank map, and basically every time the players enter the whole purpose is to explore the Forbidden Lands. They've been like covered by this blood haze for years, and people couldn't leave their towns and stuff. And now the blood haze is lifted, and nobody knows why. And now you're going out and you're exploring to see like what's out there. And every game of Forbidden Lands is different. They give you the same base map with mountains and trees and valleys and grasslands, but they don't tell you anything that's in any of the hexes. The hexes are all blank other than the terrain. And whenever you enter the hex, and a new hex, the GM has a whole book of random things that could be in a hex. And they're random encounters, and they're just like adventure seeds. There's like a whole book of, I don't remember, like 150 of them, right? And when you walk in there, the GM rolls on a table or draws from a deck of cards or however they do it. And this hex is a gnome scouting party with a mine in it, right? Like they came out of a mine and they're looking for something. And you run that encounter. And in your version of the Forbidden Lands, 2 hexes outside of this town is that mine. And in my version, that mine might be on the other side of the map. My guys might never encounter it. The entire thing is randomly generated. It is actually against the intention of the rule designers of Forbidden Lands for you to make up storylines ahead of time, right? And tons of people play the game that way. You can easily play D&D that way. There are tables in their own Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition for making up stories on the fly by random rolls. And there are also tables in the other supplements like Tasha's and stuff to make up storylines with random rolls. How are you going to have interwoven stories if you're randomly rolling the storyline? It's like he's rejecting their advice in their own books. And he's rejecting the advice of dozens of expert GMs all over the internet who have been doing this for years and saying, don't make up these explicit storylines. Don't try to interweave storylines ahead of time. See what happens at the table. Let the players build the story with you. So my advice to you guys is don't follow Mr. Haeck's advice. Like if you want to do that, fine. But don't feel like your campaign has to have 3 interwoven stories that interweave into the stories of all the backgrounds of the characters if that's not what you and your fellow players want to do. Run the game how you want. There are hundreds of ways to play D&D, not just James Haeck's way. Not just the way you see on these popular streams where they have these epic storylines. They have to do that on Critical Role and Chain of Acheron and stuff because it's a show. And people are watching. And they can't just do random stuff because it wouldn't be something people want to follow necessarily. Right? Although I will say, if you watch the Wildcard show, which is Savage Worlds, they do that. They do randomly generate stuff. And it works great. And in fact, and I'll leave with this because I'll end with this because I mentioned it in a previous show, I believe, Jordan Callerman, who was the GM, said he felt the game went better when he stopped trying to plan things ahead and started just throwing out plot threads and letting the players pick it up and see where they went. And he said he felt the game became like a whole order of magnitude better when he stopped trying to make the story ahead of time. This is one of the probably the greatest GM I've ever seen on a stream. So you don't have to have 3 stories. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5, whatever you want. You don't have to interweave them. They could be separate stories that don't have anything to do with each other. Sword and Sorcery does this. They can be sequential rather than simultaneous. They don't have to have anything to do with the character backstories. What he's basically saying is every single storyline in your world should have at least one character backstory in it. Not necessarily. The overarching story of my world, which was a villain destroying the Roman Empire, didn't have anything to do with any of the character backstories. Their backstories fit in other ways for those who wanted to fit it in, and for those who didn't want to fit it in, well, didn't fit it in because they didn't want it. Right? It doesn't have to be the way he said, and it is not true that every D&D campaign has to be that way. That's my rant for today, guys. I don't normally take people on the internet, and with all due respect to Mr. Haeck, I don't want to be rude about it, but I just feel like this is terrible advice, and I hope that the people watching this video, which is thousands of times fewer than the people who read his tweet, I'm sure, will at least recognize you don't have to do it that way if you don't want. I'm not going to. And you don't have to either. Until next time, folks, I'm Scrapperlock. This has been Scrapperlock Rants on City of Heroes on the Rebirth server.